By mid-1941, the skies over Western Europe had transformed into a lethal, high-altitude laboratory of extreme aeronautical engineering. Here, at 25,000 feet, the Battle of Britain had forged a brutal new standard for aerial combat. To survive in this thin, freezing air, a fighter aircraft required two things: raw, supercharged power and the ability to climb like a rocket. The British Supermarine Spitfire and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 ruled this stratosphere. They were lightweight, agile rapiers, constantly evolving to claw just a few hundred feet higher than their adversaries. In this arena, a single second of engine lag, a minor drop in manifold pressure, or a sluggish turn meant instantaneous death. The doctrine of European air warfare was clear: dominate the high altitude or perish. But 3,000 miles away, in the sprawling, soot-stained factories of Buffalo, New York, the Curtiss Wright Corporation was churning out a completely different kind of machine. It was heavy, it was blocky. Its nose was dominated by a massive, gaping radiator intake that gave it the sinister look of an aquatic predator rather than a graceful bird of prey. This was the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. On the assembly lines, workers did not delicate stitch wood or stretch thin linen. They riveted thick, heavy-gauge aluminum plating and installed protective armor plates thick enough to stop heavy-caliber machine gun fire. It was an American prototype built with the philosophy of a locomotive: solid, unyielding, and incredibly tough. But to the elite air ministries of Europe, this rugged construction was not a virtue. It was a fatal, archaic design flaw. When the first shipment of P-40s arrived in Great Britain under the Lend-Lease policy, the Royal Air Force test pilots were blunt in their assessment. They took the American fighter into the skies over Boscombe Down and pushed it to its absolute limits. The results were devastating. Compared to the nimble Spitfire, the P-40 felt like a flying brick. It was sluggish in a turn, agonizingly slow in a vertical climb, and exceptionally heavy on the controls. The British evaluation teams wrote up their reports with cold, administrative finality. The aircraft was declared entirely unsuitable for the high-altitude interceptor battles raging over the English Channel. The RAF officially labeled the P-40 dead on arrival, a design written off as obsolete before it had even fired a single shot. The core of the P-40's failure lay deep within its mechanical heart: the Allison V1710 liquid-cooled V12 engine. Unlike the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, which utilized an advanced two-stage, two-speed supercharger to compress and force oxygen into the engine at high altitudes, the Allison was equipped with only a basic, single-stage supercharger. Mechanically, this was a catastrophe for high-altitude performance. Up to 15,000 feet, the Allison engine ran beautifully, producing a solid 1,000 horsepower. But as the aircraft climbed past that invisible boundary, the air grew thin and cold. The single-stage supercharger simply could not compress enough oxygen. The engine literally choked on the thin air, its power output dropping off a cliff. At 20,000 feet, where the Messerschmitts and Spitfires engaged in deadly vertical maneuvers, the P-40 was a gasping, wallowing target, entirely at the mercy of any enemy diving from above. For the British, the decision was easy. They rejected the P-40 for frontline service in Western Europe, relegating the few they did accept to low-altitude ground attack roles in the deserts of North Africa, or redirecting the shipments entirely. The American aviation press was equally unkind, whispering that the nation's premier export fighter was an embarrassment to American industrial capability. Curtiss Wright was left with dozens of unwanted, rejected airframes sitting on the tarmac in Buffalo, their pristine olive-drab paint gathering dust. To the global military establishment, the P-40 was a write-off, a design that had failed its first and most important test. But half a world away, across the vast, war-weary landscapes of East Asia, there was a nation that did not have the luxury of European snobbishness. China was in its 5th year of a brutal, undeclared war of survival against the Japanese Empire. Its cities were being systematically reduced to ash. Its tiny, poorly trained air force had been completely wiped from the sky by a new, terrifying breed of Japanese fighters. For the Chinese people, there were no Spitfires coming to save them. There was no high-tech radar net. There was only a desperate, suffocating sky filled with enemy bombers. To the leaders in Chongqing, those rejected, dusty P-40s sitting in Buffalo were not obsolete garbage. They were a miracle. They were the last, desperate hope of a dying nation. What the European experts failed to realize is that the rules of war are not universal. A weapon that is useless in the thin, cold air of the English Channel might be a devastating hammer in the humid, low-altitude valleys of Burma and southern China. The stage was now set for one of the greatest tactical turnarounds in aviation history. An obsolete, rejected American prototype was about to embark on a journey across the globe. There, in the hands of a band of rogue volunteers led by a discarded tactical genius, this heavy, shark-mouthed beast would do what the experts claimed was impossible. It would completely break the back of the invincible Japanese air armada. In the spring of 1937, the man who would save the skies of China was an outcast, discarded by his own country as a military relic. Captain Claire Lee Chennault was 47 years old, partially deaf from years of flying in open cockpits, plagued with chronic bronchitis, and deeply bitter. For over a decade, Chennault had argued passionately for a radical rewrite of American fighter doctrine. He claimed that the traditional, elegant dogfight, where pilots engaged in individual, chivalrous turning duels, was a romantic myth of the past. He advocated for tight, coordinated team tactics, aggressive speed, and heavy firepower. But the conservative theorists of the Army Air Corps ridiculed him, choosing to believe that the bomber was unstoppable and that defensive fighters were obsolete. Forced into early retirement, Chennault packed his bags, believing his military career was dead. But destiny had other plans. That same year, Chennault received a quiet, unofficial offer from Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the head of the Chinese Aeronautical Affairs Commission. His mission was simple, yet monumental. Travel to China under the guise of a civilian surveyor and assess the crumbling Chinese Air Force. When Chennault arrived, he found a nation on the brink of total annihilation. The Japanese Empire had launched a massive, coordinated invasion, and their modern warplanes were systematically wiping out China's obsolete air arm. The Chinese pilots, though brave, were flying a mismatched collection of biplanes and outdated export fighters, guided by foreign instructors who still taught the useless, archaic dogfighting techniques of World War I. They were being slaughtered in the skies, and the smoke of burning Chinese cities rose to clog the atmosphere. Then, in the summer of 1940, the Japanese deployed a weapon that shattered what little hope remained. It was the Mitsubishi A6M Type Zero, known to history simply as the Zero. Designed by the brilliant engineer Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero was an absolute masterpiece of minimalist construction. To achieve an unprecedented power-to-weight ratio, Horikoshi used a top-secret, highly advanced aluminum alloy called Sumitomo Extra Super Duralumin. Every gram of excess weight was ruthlessly stripped away. The wings were built directly into the fuselage structure to eliminate heavy bolts. There was absolutely no armor plating to protect the pilot, and the wing-mounted fuel tanks lacked any self-sealing rubber coating.
It was a fragile, high-performance racehorse built with a single, uncompromising purpose: ultimate maneuverability.
The result was an aerodynamic monster that defied the laws of traditional air combat. The Zero possessed a wing loading so low that it could perform tight vertical loops and razor-sharp turns that would instantly cause any Allied fighter to stall and spin. It could climb at a rate of over 3,000 feet per minute, and its operational range was a staggering 1,900 miles, nearly double that of its contemporary rivals. Standard Western fighter manuals taught that to defeat an enemy, you had to get behind them and outturn them, but the Zero made this impossible. If an Allied pilot attempted to engage a Zero in a turning duel, the Japanese fighter would simply turn inside his circle within 2 rotations, slide onto his tail, and shred his aircraft with its wing-mounted 20mm cannons. In September of 1940, over the skies of Chongqing, a flight of 13 Zeros intercepted 34 Chinese fighters. In a matter of minutes, the Zero shot down 24 Chinese planes and damaged the rest. Not a single Japanese Zero was lost. It was a complete massacre, and the Allied intelligence agencies dismissed it as Chinese incompetence. But Chennault did not. Sitting in his makeshift headquarters in Kunming, he gathered the flight telemetry, analyzed the bullet trajectories on salvaged wreckage, and studied the Japanese logs. He realized that the Zero was technically superior in every traditional metric. You could not outclimb it, you could not outturn it, you could not outloop it. If his pilots tried to fight a traditional dogfight against the Zero, they would die. But Chennault's analytical, unorthodox mind saw the Zero's fatal flaw hidden beneath its brilliant performance. The very lightness that gave the Zero its supernatural agility was also its ultimate vulnerability. It had no protection. It had no structural resilience. It could not survive a heavy, concentrated blow. To exploit this weakness, Chennault needed a specific kind of aircraft, not a light, agile dancer, but a heavy, blunt force instrument. He needed a plane that could dive like a falling anvil and withstand immense aerodynamic stress without ripping its own wings off. He looked across the Pacific, past the rejections of the European experts, and saw his weapon waiting in the dusty yards of Buffalo. He saw the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The rejected American prototype was about to meet the tactical genius who knew exactly how to wield its heavy steel armor. By early 1941, Claire Chennault's plan to save China had moved from a desperate dream to a highly classified covert operation. Recognizing that the fall of China would hand the Japanese Empire unchecked dominance over East Asia, President Franklin Roosevelt signed a secret executive order. It authorized the creation of the first American Volunteer Group, AVG. To the public, they were civilian volunteers. In reality, recruiters moved like ghosts through American military bases, quietly offering active-duty Navy, Marine, and Army pilots a chance at real combat, a lucrative salary of $600 a month, and a $500 bounty for every confirmed Japanese aircraft they destroyed. Over 100 pilots and ground crew members accepted the gamble, resigning their commissions and boarding Dutch liners under false passports, listed as planters, clerks, and missionaries. Their destination was Kiaida Airfield, a miserable, malaria-infested strip of asphalt hacked out of the dense Burmese jungle. It was here, amidst the stifling heat, swarms of mosquitoes, and the constant smell of rotting vegetation, that the volunteers met their mounts. Sitting on the muddy tarmac were 99 Curtiss H-81A2 fighters, export variants of the P-40 originally destined for Great Britain but redirected to China. The airframes were rugged, but they arrived in pieces, stripped of their military radios, gun sights, and bomb racks.
Under the relentless, exhausting tropical sun, American mechanics, working with nothing more than basic hand tools and raw ingenuity, began the monumental task of assembling these heavy metal beasts from the ground up, turning rejected scrap into a unified fighting force. It was during this frantic assembly phase that the AVG transformed their rejected machines into an immortal visual icon. While flipping through an illustrated British magazine, pilot Eric Schilling spotted a photograph of a P-40 flown by the RAF's 112 Squadron in North Africa, which featured a painted shark mouth over the nose radiator. Schilling was struck by how perfectly the design fit the P-40's aggressive, gaping chin intake. Chennault immediately approved the idea, and soon every hangar at Tonggu was filled with pilots and mechanics wielding paintbrushes. They coated the noses of their fighters with razor-sharp, blood-red mouths, jagged white teeth, and cold, predatory eyes. To the Chinese civilians who watched these terrifying machines take off, they were not sharks, but Fei Hu, the flying tigers. It was a psychological masterpiece, turning a clumsy radiator housing into a face of pure mechanical malice.
Underneath that terrifying paint, the P-40 was built like a flying fortress. While European critics condemned the fighter for its weight, Chennault understood that this mass was its greatest asset. The P-40 boasted structural protection that was virtually science fiction compared to the fragile Japanese Zero. Behind the pilot's head sat a massive 3/4-inch slab of armored steel plate. The windshield was made of multi-layered, bulletproof glass capable of stopping a direct hit from rifle-caliber rounds. Most importantly, the fuel tanks were lined with self-sealing rubber. If a Japanese bullet punctured the tank, the fuel would react with the rubber, causing it to swell and instantly seal the hole, preventing the catastrophic explosive fires that routinely claimed Japanese aircraft. This heavy engineering meant the P-40 weighed nearly 9,000 pounds fully loaded, almost double the weight of the Featherlight Zero. To fly the P-40 was to fly an anvil of solid steel. If the Zero was a masterfully forged samurai sword, the P-40 was a blunt, heavy battle axe. It could not dance, but it could crush. Under Chennault's obsessive daily instruction, the pilots of the AVG began to understand this physical reality. They spent hours studying the flight envelopes, learning that their heavy-gauge aluminum wings could withstand diving forces that would literally rip the wings off any Japanese fighter in existence. They had the armor to survive, the weight to outdive the enemy, and a massive battery of 4 wing-mounted 30-caliber machine guns and 2 cowl-mounted 50-caliber machine guns, capable of vaporizing wooden structures in a single burst. By December of 1941, the preparation was over. Just days after the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States directly into World War II, the Japanese launched their massive aerial armada toward Kunming, the vital gateway to the Burma Road. The Allied forces across the Pacific were retreating in chaos and defeat, their airfields burning and their spirits broken. The Japanese High Command expected an easy, uncontested victory over the skies of China. They believed the sky belonged to them, and that no outdated American aircraft could stand in their way. But as their bomber formations hummed over the mountains, they had no idea that waiting for them in the clouds was a band of rogue, highly paid mercenaries flying heavy, steel-plated monsters with teeth painted on their noses. The Flying Tigers were about to unleash the broadsword.
On the eve of their first combat mission, Claire Chennault stood before their recruits and shattered their collective ego. These were hotshot Navy, Marine, and Army pilots trained in the traditional romantic art of individual dogfighting. They were eager to climb into the clouds and duel the Japanese turn for turn. But Chennault's voice raspy from years of chronic bronchitis, cut through their arrogance like a knife. He gave them a single, uncompromising command: never dogfight a Zero. He explained the cold, mathematical reality of their situation. If they tried to turn with the ultra-lightweight Japanese fighters, they would be dead within 2 rotations. To survive, they had to unlearn every instinct they had been taught in American flight schools. They had to stop acting like knights and start acting like assassins. To replace the traditional dogfight, Chennault introduced a revolutionary concept of energy tactics that he called the dive and run. It was a system designed to exploit the P-40's massive weight and unmatched structural strength. At high speeds, the lightweight, unarmored Japanese Zero suffered from a severe physical limitation known as control stiffness. Above 300 miles per hour, the aerodynamic pressure over the Zero's canvas-covered control surfaces became so immense that the pilot literally did not have the physical strength to move the stick. The Zero's wings would bend, its ailerons would freeze, and at extreme speeds, its light aluminum frame would disintegrate. The heavy P-40, however, was built like a tank. It could plunge into a vertical dive at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour with absolute structural stability, its heavy-gauge metal wings slicing through the high-velocity air without a flinch. But to dive on the enemy, the Flying Tigers first had to get above them, a monumental challenge for an aircraft like the P-40, which climbed as slowly as a loaded truck. The solution lay not in the sky, but on the ground. Chennault utilized the unsung heroes of the air war, the Chinese human warning net. This was a vast, sprawling network of thousands of civilian spotters stationed on mountaintops, in remote villages, and behind enemy lines. Equipped with primitive radios, telegraphs, and hand-cranked telephones, these spotters watched the skies 24 hours a day. The moment a Japanese formation took off, the information was passed instantly from village to village, straight to Chennault's headquarters. This incredible human radar system gave the Flying Tigers up to 45 minutes of advance warning, giving the heavy P-40s the precious time they needed to slowly climb to 20,000 feet and wait in the sun.
On December 20, 1941, just 13 days after Pearl Harbor, the system was put to its first ultimate test over Kunming. 10 Japanese bombers, confident in their invincibility, approached the city without fighter escorts. They had no idea that Chennault's warning net had already pinned their location. High above them, the Flying Tigers rolled their shark-mouthed P-40s into a steep, roaring dive. They did not break formation. Flying in disciplined two-plane elements, they utilized their massive diving momentum to scream through the Japanese bombers at terminal velocity. The pilots lined up their crude ring and bead sights and squeezed the triggers on their joysticks. The firepower of the P-40 was absolutely devastating. Unlike the light Japanese aircraft, which carried small-caliber machine guns, each P-40 was armed with a combination of .50 caliber and .30 caliber machine guns. When these 6 guns fired in unison, they unleashed a torrent of heavy steel and incendiary ammunition that could shred wood, canvas, and unarmored aluminum in seconds. A single 2-second burst from a P-40 was enough to literally tear a Japanese bomber in half. In a matter of minutes, the Flying Tigers decimated the formation. Out of 10 Japanese bombers, 9 were shot down or damaged so severely they crashed on the return flight. The AVG did not lose a single pilot. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered in a single afternoon. But the true crucible of the Flying Tigers was forged in the skies over Rangoon, Burma, during the desperate Christmas battles of 1941.
Here, a tiny force of just 20 AVG pilots, flying alongside a handful of British RAF pilots, defended the vital port city against a massive onslaught of hundreds of Japanese fighters and bombers. Day after day, pilots like David Lee, Tex Hill, and Jack Newkirk flew until their eyes were bloodshot and their muscles ached from the extreme G-forces. They would dive, strike, run, and climb back up to do it again, using the P-40's heavy armor to absorb incoming fire that would have vaporized any other fighter. Tex Hill would later describe the smell of cordite and burning hydraulic fluid filling his cockpit, and the terrifying sight of Japanese Zeros swarming like angry hornets. But the tactics held. By the time the American Volunteer Group was officially absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces in July of 1942, they had achieved what military analysts considered an absolute impossibility. With an active force that rarely exceeded 30 operational P-40 aircraft at any given time, the Flying Tigers had officially destroyed 299 Japanese planes, with another 300 unconfirmed. They lost only 12 P-40s in aerial combat. It was a lopsided, near-miraculous kill ratio of 24-1. At a time when the Allied forces were suffering crushing defeats across the entire Pacific theater, the rejected American prototype and its rogue pilots had single-handedly held the line, giving a shattered, demoralized Western world its first taste of victories of the war.
On July 4, 1942, the legendary run of the American Volunteer Group came to an abrupt, unceremonious end. In a cold, bureaucratic transition, the Flying Tigers were officially disbanded, absorbed directly into the regular United States Army Air Forces as the 23rd Fighter Group. Many of the battle-weary volunteers, exhausted by malaria, constant combat, and the suffocating pressure of a forgotten front, packed their worn leather bags and boarded ships for home. Of the original 99 P-40 fighters shipped to Burma, only a handful of airframes survived the meat grinder. They were held together by baling wire, mismatched screws, and sheet metal cannibalized from wrecked planes. Yet, as these battered, shark-mouthed predators were repainted with standard American insignia, they left behind a legacy that completely rewrote the rules of 20th-century air combat. To truly appreciate what the P-40 achieved in the skies of China, one must look at the terrifying strategic landscape of early 1942. The Allied war effort in the Pacific was in a state of absolute catastrophic collapse. The U.S. Navy was reeling from Pearl Harbor, the British Empire had lost Singapore in a humiliating defeat, and the American garrison in the Philippines had surrendered at Bataan. Amidst this relentless tide of darkness, the Flying Tigers and their rugged P-40s were the only shining light in the entire Allied world. They did not just win tactical dogfights, they held the back door of China open. By keeping the Burma Road and the airspace over Kunming clear of Japanese bombers, they ensured that China stayed in the war. If China had capitulated, over 2 million Japanese soldiers would have been freed up to invade India, sweep through Australia, or fortify the Pacific Islands to an impregnable degree. The P-40 Warhawk bought the United States its most precious, irreplaceable commodity of World War II: time. While these obsolete, rejected fighters were clawing through the skies of Burma and China, the industrial engine of the United States was spooling up. The lessons learned by Chennault's pilots on the physical limitations of the Japanese Zero were analyzed by American engineers in real time. The data gathered from the P-40's combat logs directly influenced the development of the next generation of American air power. It paved the way for heavy, armored, high-horsepower fighters like the Hellcat, the Corsair, and the legendary Mustang.
The P-40 did not have to be the best plane of the war. It simply had to hold the line until the arsenal of democracy could build the machines that would finish it. The extraordinary saga of the P-40 Warhawk proves a fundamental, timeless truth of military history. There is no such thing as an obsolete weapon, only weapons used with the wrong tactics. European experts looked at the P-40 on a sheet of paper and saw a failure. They saw a heavy, slow-climbing machine that was useless in their high-altitude, chivalrous dogfights, but they lacked the vision of Claire Lee Chennault. The discarded, half-deaf tactical genius looked at the exact same machine and saw a devastating, armored hammer. He understood that a weapon is only as good as the doctrine behind it. In the hands of rogue pilots who refused to play by the enemy's rules, an American reject became an immortal legend of the eastern skies, proving that grit, adaptation, and raw physical durability will always triumph over paper specifications. The shark-mouthed P-40 Warhawk was never the fastest plane in the sky. It was never the most agile, and it never flew the highest. But when the world was burning and there was nothing else left, it was the machine that took the blow, held the line, and taught the invincible Japanese Empire how to fall from the sky. It remains a monument to what can be achieved when raw human courage is paired with a rugged, unyielding design that simply refuses to break. The triumph of the Flying Tigers remains one of the brilliant tactical reversals in the history of aviation, a testament to the power of human adaptability over raw technology. But now, we want to hear your thoughts. In today's era of multi-million-dollar, ultra-complex stealth jets, do you think modern militaries have placed too much faith in high-tech specifications on paper? Have we forgotten the value of simple, rugged, and mass-producible designs like the P-40? Let us know your opinions in the comments below. We read and value every single response. If you want to discover more raw, untold chapters of military history, make sure to hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next episode.